Live. Hello, welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for so very, very, very many reasons. I apologize for the late start. Usually we start at 1 p.m. Central Time. It's about 1:09 right now. I am, as I have been for the last few weeks, for the most part, on and off, but for the most part, for the last several weeks, I've been working remotely. I'm doing that again today. Um, that's the different location. Um, This is not therapy. It's just an open conversation, like any other conversation. I'm here. I'll be talking about whatever it is I'm talking about. You're here. I'm going to do my best to make my guesses be, that what I am talking about, what I'm saying, it will be influenced, impacted by my thoughts about who you all are that are watching this, whether that's live now or in the future as a VOD, what you're interested in, what you're hearing, how I'm coming across, how I'm impacting you. For those of you who are willing and able to participate in the chat, I appreciate that because it gives me a lot more information on which to base those guesses about who you are and what you're interested in and how I'm impacting you. Um, I will do my best to read out comments as they come in because we're live streaming on 3 different platforms simultaneously, and you'll only see comments in the chat on your respective website. So if you're on Facebook and somebody puts in a comment on Twitch, you won't see it. So I try to read them all out so that we're all on the same page. Um, I work with a private therapy practice called Effective Artistry. We do individual, couples, family, and group therapy with people in the state of Illinois and people in the state of Wisconsin. We also work with a couple executive functioning coaches who work with people all over the country via the internet, all over the world via the internet, actually. Our physical office is in Northbrook, Illinois. Trying to think what I've missed. I'm running. I started late, as I mentioned, so I'm trying to get through things quickly. Um, yeah, please don't worry about keeping things on topic if you're participating in the chat. Whatever I'm discussing is just whatever. Like I said, I'm doing my best to take into account what people in general who are watching this stream or this video might be interested in. Um, but we'll go all over the place, and please don't hesitate to jump in if you want to say something about something that's different than what I'm talking about. Please go ahead, jump in. When I do presentations, actually, when I train staff, when I hire and train therapists to work for our practice, and when I do presentations, I tell people right up front to interrupt me, that I like being interrupted. And I actually do. Interruption is a very important part of efficient communication. There are obviously times and places, contexts in which interruption makes things worse. But generally, the stuff that we're doing is not that. And so interruption is better. Um, we can talk about that a little bit, I guess. Maybe that's worth talking about. But please interrupt me. There's this. There's generally an idea that it's bad to interrupt people, and there are lots of rules like this, right? And that's good. It's useful. But we individual humans, we make all kinds of mistakes all the time. Obviously, we're limited and flawed, and even when we're consciously thinking about everything, we come to inaccurate conclusions. But there's all kinds of mistakes that we make that don't involve consciously thinking. Not noticing something that would have been useful to notice is an example where we didn't consciously decide not to notice that, but something internal to us, something about us decided or determined that our attention was better spent wherever else. And only in retrospect can we realize that that would have been useful to notice. Uh, One of those mistakes that we make, so when we make mistakes in patterns, we try and look at the mechanisms, the reasons that these mistakes happen. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about cognitive biases. We're talking about just we know that humans make mistakes. We look at the patterns of those mistakes and we try to identify mechanisms that we think contribute, a useful way to talk about what might have happened of why someone would have ended up making that mistake. And there are many ways, many types of things that we can talk about. But one of those is cognitive biases. That's what we mean. And generally, cognitive biases boil down to effectively that we behave as though the information we have access to is the relevant information, and any information we don't have access to isn't relevant, and we can take action anyway. And this is like non-optional, but also important, because you wouldn't ever be able to do, none of us would ever be able to do anything if we were sitting there thinking like, well, of all the infinite pieces of information that I don't know, some number of that, some amount of that is important to the potential action I'm considering taking, and I shouldn't take action until I have found that information. If we were to do that, we don't take action, and we do that all the time, right? Like that is a thing that happens, that we think like, I'm going to get some more information before I try and do something here. But obviously, every time we do something, we're assuming, we're acting as though whatever information we don't have isn't something that we need to get in order to be able to do whatever we're about to try to do. That applies in a bunch of specific ways, and so you can break them down into different cognitive biases or group them up in different ways. And yet, focusing on what I don't know is not efficient. Oh, and yes, focusing on what I don't know is not efficient. Yeah. So, as with everything, it's nuanced, right? That there are times we could pick a scenario and say, like, well, that's a time that it would have been really helpful or even important that a person not take action until they get some information that they didn't have at the time. There are other times that we can say, well, that person could have taken action based on the information they had at the time and everything would have been fine. So being able to separate out when is when, or which is which, question, I think that's an autocorrect. I think that's wisdom is in the doing, not the knowing, which I do think is an interesting. It's often talked about that wisdom is about the application of knowledge. Knowing things is knowing things. Wisdom is about how do you utilize the things that you know. And that is effectively what we're always talking about, right? It's like we're doing our best to identify this is a time when it's worth gathering more information before I take action. This is a time where it's not. But at the base level, because as we've talked about before, the vast majority of what we do involves no conscious thought at all. So certainly no like conscious decision about, oh, this is a time that it's worth taking action without information. We just act. That's why I am talking about it today, and you'll hear me at times say we act as though blank blank instead of, we act because we know or we think of it, whatever. Where I am right now, you are right now acting as though gravity is a constant that will continue to persist as we know it. That doesn't mean that I or you or any of us thought about like, is gravity going to continue to operate the way that it's? No, we're not consciously thinking about it. But we can still say we're acting as though it is a constant, because we can say if I or you or anybody thought, well, gravity might shut off or stop working in a second here, if somebody thought that, they would be doing very different things than what I am currently doing. If I thought gravity was about to stop working, I would probably not be streaming. I would shut this down and I would be trying to like get in touch with my family and keep everybody safe, right? So we're acting as though, even though we're not consciously thinking about it. So cognitive biases are not things that you can correct. You can't change, like that's one of the mistakes that people make in talking about these things, is that it's as though knowing about it then is supposed to enable you to make sure that it never happens. That's not the case. You cannot overcome these things. With an increased awareness of them, you can then like apply that, right? Instead of being able to catch the cognitive biases all the time, which you won't be able to do, cognition rests on processes that filter out a bunch of stuff. You have to. But you can be, for example, more open after having done something to getting feedback or information that suggests that you missed on something. If you know that there's cognitive biases involved, then it allows you to see things through that lens, that these are just processes. It's not like I made some ego-driven determination to ignore information, right? Anyway, one of those cognitive biases uh, results in, again, people label them differently, but results in us thinking that the things that are discussed the most are the most common things, which is not true. In fact, it is quite often the opposite of that. In the case of news is a famous example that we talk about, um, that things which happen very commonly, are humdrum day to day, are not worth talking about in the news. So when something unusual happens, something that never happens, that becomes news and we talk about it more. So the things that are most discussed in the news are the least common things, but we walk away from that thinking that they're the most common. This is how people get impressions. Like a very famous example recently is how people think of Chicago as being an incredibly dangerous city because they hear stories about violence or, various dangerous things happening in Chicago, and they hear enough of it, they hear that so much that they come to the conclusion that that's what's happening all the time and that's the most common experience in that city, when obviously it's not. um, Back to interruption, because that's genuinely what I was starting down this whole path to explain is, when we get told like don't interrupt, interrupting is rude, interrupting is bad manners, whatever, that gets discussed a lot, and so we draw the conclusion that that is true, or at least the most common thing to act as though it is true. If everybody from when we were young is telling us that it's bad to interrupt, we we come to the conclusion that interrupting is a bad thing to do, and that makes sense. But this is one of those cases where I was going to say the opposite is true, but I don't mean that it's opposite. The opposite as in it's not, it's good to interrupt, although I do mean that to some extent. Uh, I mean that just because it's the thing that we talk about the most, it doesn't mean it's the thing that is the most true. In fact, it's the opposite, because the things that we learn to do by nature, the way that we learn things initially is purely through experimentation. And so whatever ends up being optimal is the thing that we do. There's a lot about, we can focus in on locomotion, the way that like children, babies, toddlers, whatever, learn to walk. And when a like babies, toddlers who have just or are in the process or of learning to walk have much better posture and much better balance than those same people will later on in life. Things impact our posture. But in the beginning, you're literally just trying to like balance, right? Not fall over. And so you end up over time, trial and error, fall, try again, fall, try again. You end up with a balance that is like optimal because you arrived at that conclusion of standing and walking in that way because it is the thing that works the best. Not because anybody's told you anything or because you're mimicking anything, but because that works the best. Now, that's interruption. We interrupt because it is optimally efficient. We arrive at interruption. Nobody had to teach us to interrupt. We just do it automatically. That doesn't mean that interrupting is always good. It certainly is not. There are many, many cases in which it is detrimental, problematic, it makes things worse for the person doing the interrupting and for other people. But that's the part we have to teach. So there are some things that we don't arrive at these conclusions via our own experience and just figuring it out. Some things we learn via communication with other people. Other people tell us about stuff. Interruption is one of those. Interrupting being bad or rude is one of those things. So, for example, here is a context in which generally interruption is problematic, is when you are one of a group and there is one person talking to the entire group. In that scenario, you being a member of the group interrupting that one person is detrimental, generally speaking. Now that's what school is, right? And all of us, I know there are edge cases, but for the most part, all of us were in school starting at the age of 5 until the age of 18, and then many of us continued on after that. And that's where you first really start learning about don't interrupt, right? Kindergarten, we don't interrupt, we raise our hand to talk. These are like such fundamental and universal rules that we don't even think of them as rules. We just, by the time you're an adult, you just take it for granted that, yeah, you raise your hand when you have something to say. But obviously that's a learned behavior, right? Like nobody just instinctually is like, I'm going to raise my hand when I have something to say. The point of that is that just shouting out can be detrimental to what's going on in this environment. So if you have something to say, give me a visual indication that I'll be able to see as the teacher from, anywhere around the room. So put it up above other people's heads. Give me a visual indication that you have something to say, and then I will tell you it's okay to talk when I've reached a point where you can talk without it being detrimental. So it's true, again, generally, most of the time it is true, that interrupting in an environment like that causes a problem. So it's useful that we get taught to do those things in that environment. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden interrupting is bad in a one-on-one conversation with your friend later on. And if any of you pay attention, you interrupt in those kinds of conversations all the time, and you are interrupted in those kinds of conversations all the time. For the most part, that doesn't cause a problem. We do it because it makes things more efficient. If you say something, if you're saying something to me and you say, you get to a part of it that I don't quite follow, I'm like, oh, I don't know what that meant, but I don't interrupt. I want to let you finish. Whatever you say from that point forward, I'm not really going to follow. So that's inefficient because you're now taking all this time and energy to express something to me, thinking that it will be useful, that I'll get something out of it, I'll understand something, or that I'm following along with you when I'm not. So then after you're done talking, either at that point, then I say, I'm confused about, and now we go back to the point where I first got confused. So we're just at best duplicating all that effort. Or at worst, I pretend as though I followed along with everything that you said, or at least don't give you any indication that I didn't. I just say whatever I'm about to say next, even though I didn't hear or understand or retain so much of what you just said, which causes problems down the line because now you're talking to me as though you're using language in ways that would make sense to do if I had heard everything you said. You're operating as though I heard and understood everything that you said. So you're going to say things that make no sense to me because they rely on some information that you did share and have reason to believe I heard, but I didn't really. And I'm going to say things that are built on the assumption that, they're ignoring any of that stuff. And sometimes that stuff is going to change the way you interpret what I'm saying. It causes all kinds of problems. Let's say you say something I have an objection to. Still, same thing. After that, I'm stuck on my objection. So it's better to pop that out. Let's say I'm just bored or whatever. My mind starts to wander. I get distracted, whatever. Same thing. You can call it rude if you want. That's fine. And I would even possibly agree with you given certain context. But either way, it doesn't change the efficiency of the communication. It's still like if I'm thinking about other things and you're continuing to talk, I'm not hearing what you're saying. You're wasting your time and energy, or at least you're spending your resources in a way that you deem to be worth doing, built on the assumption that I'm getting something out of it. I'm understanding or hearing you to some extent, which isn't true. So you wouldn't be doing that if you knew that I wasn't really hearing you. There's so much to say, but I feel like I'm just running on and on about this. I don't know. Please jump in if I'm trying to build in too much stuff and losing people. Some of the other contexts in which interruption becomes problematic is sometimes you interrupt. So we just named a bunch of things where like I'm interrupting because whatever's happening in my mind is preventing me from hearing whatever you're saying from here on out. So I got to interrupt to say it so that you don't spend all that time saying all that and you think I heard you and I didn't really. Another reason that I might interrupt is because you start saying something and I hear enough of it that I'm able to then draw a conclusion about the point that you're making or what it is that you're trying to say, even though you haven't finished saying it yet. Now, that is very efficient, in fact, more efficient than not interrupting if I have drawn the accurate conclusion, right? So if you start to say, hey, next Tuesday, and then I'm like, I know, we're going to the doctor or whatever. If that is what you were trying to say to me, then great. I confirmed it and we can move on. You don't have to say the whole thing. But if I got it wrong, hey, next Tuesday, and I say, yeah, I'm prepared. We're going to the doctor. And then you say, no, I'm not talking about that. Now I've made it less efficient, even if you get it right back on track, right? This is a best case scenario here. You say, hey, next Tuesday. I say, I know, we're going to the doctor. You can tell I'm a parent of young children, going to the doctor is a we activity. I know we're going to the doctor. this is a best case scenario because I just identified to you, I gave you enough information so that you know that I drew the wrong conclusion and you knew exactly what it was. And you can just clarify right off the bat, like, oh no, I was saying afterwards, do you want to get some dinner or whatever? Even in that best case scenario, it's still less efficient because, I said some stuff that didn't contribute to what we were trying to get to, and you had to say some stuff that didn't contribute to what we were trying to get to just to correct me. But more often than, well, I shouldn't say more often than not, what will sometimes happen is that my response doesn't clarify to you that I didn't draw the right conclusion. This is one of the worst case scenarios is you say, hey, next Tuesday. And I say, yeah, I know. And I'm thinking about the doctor's appointment, but you're thinking about how Aunt Myrtle's coming into town and I need to pick her up at the airport or whatever. Because I said, yeah, I know, I got it. It's in my calendar, whatever. You were thinking of me picking up Aunt Myrtle at the airport. I was thinking of a different thing, the doctor. But you might think that you draw the conclusion, obviously, since you're thinking about Aunt Myrtle, and I say, yeah, I know, I'm doing it. You're like, oh, okay, he knows about Aunt Myrtle. And then Aunt Myrtle doesn't get picked up at the airport because I didn't give you enough information to know that I drew the wrong conclusion. That happens all the time. So much so that we see it in like sitcoms and, you know, movies and whatever, because it's such a good way to be able to have humorous misunderstandings arise is that somebody cuts somebody else off, draws a conclusion, gives an indication that each person thinks is like, yeah, I'm confirming what I think, and the other person thinks, yeah, they're confirming what I think, and it's two different things. So that's a time where sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. As a, again, general rule, not that I expect anybody to like internalize and do these things every time, but if that's the reason you're cutting somebody off, jumping in, it's still efficient to jump in, but you want to do it in a way that indicates what conclusion you have drawn. Sorry, are you talking to me about the doctor's appointment? Because I got that. Instead of just like, yeah, I got it. So that if I'm wrong, we can clarify. And if I do it that way, then it does, even in the case where I've gotten it wrong, it does at least provide the possibility that things are more efficient because now you can build off of what I just said instead of having to lay out a whole picture. Like maybe you were getting ready to say next Tuesday we've got the doctor's appointment, but then don't forget after that there's Aunt Myrtle or whatever. Where if I said, yeah, it's the doctor's appointment you're talking about, you can say, well, there is that and Aunt Myrtle. I'm pulling up some pretty random examples, and in this case, I'm unsatisfied with that example because there are cases in which, so one that's like more likely to result in benefit, right? Is something like, wait, are you saying that you're mad at me because I let you down? I don't know, just making stuff up. Are you saying you're mad at me because I let you down? Is the kind of thing where like a person might be trying to express like this happened and then you did this and I'm feeling this way and whatever. And if I say, are you upset because I let you down? Then even if it's like, no, it's not that, that gives me information. If I'm the person trying to explain why I'm mad, that gives me information about what you think I'm talking about. So good for me to clarify, like, no, that's not what I'm trying to say. And gives me something to build off. Like, no, I don't feel let down. I don't think you let me down. I'm just trying to talk about what happened. So that's good because now you're not continuing to hear this through the lens of thinking like, oh, they're mad at me because I failed them or whatever. Theoretically, at least there's the possibility. One of the times that stop interrupting as a rule comes up most, I was going to say most commonly, and I think that's probably true, but I guess what I really am talking about is of all the times that we notice someone interrupting us and we don't like it, and all the times that we interrupt someone and they don't like it and they say something about it, a lot of those things that we notice and remember happen in the course of arguments with people that we have close relationships with. um, if I'm angry and you're angry, we're fighting about something and I'm trying to explain my point of view and you want me to understand your point of view, and so you interrupt me to say your point of view, then that very easily could make me more angry. Like, you just interrupted me. You're not even letting me say. I'm trying to get you to understand what I. And the other person is also saying like, no, I interrupted you because you interrupted me earlier because I want you to hear what I'm trying to say. I get it. You're trying to say your thing, but you didn't even let me say my. It can get worse. A lot of the time that is just from a like you're not listening. So it's that first category of interruption we talked about where it's still useful to interrupt because otherwise, if I'm just going to rattle off everything I'm saying, but you're not hearing it anyway, that's not great. Except in the specific circumstance where it doesn't really matter what I'm saying or that you hear it. I just want some indication that you are willing to listen and we don't ever need to say anything about it. In that case, you even behaving as though you are hearing what I'm saying can still resolve the issue, but that's a very rare, rare thing. Very rare thing. Don't don't go thinking that like that's if I just which probably sounds, I'm guessing sounds like it's, who would pretend to be hearing something, but we do it all the time. It's maybe the most common version of like it's rude to interrupt. I'm not hearing what they're saying, but I don't want them to know that I'm not hearing what they're saying because that would be so rude. And they finish like as I often do, does that make sense? Or what did you hear me say? Or what are you thinking? And then it's still like an active effort of, okay, I don't know what they said, but I gotta give a response that makes it seem like I heard what they said. Yeah, no, I think you raise some interesting points. Or what, we have all kinds of things that we can say that I didn't hear it, but this will give you the sense that I heard it, which causes so many problems. Interruption is very inefficient, again, almost always in a group setting where one person's trying to talk to the group. Because even if I am losing track or don't know what you mean, that doesn't mean that the other people, maybe 20 other people are all following along with you. And so me jumping into this to ask about my misunderstanding or clarify what I'm thinking derails everybody else's understanding. And now I've got to get those people back on track after addressing whatever you said. It still makes the communication between the individual who would otherwise be interrupting and the, we'll say teacher right now, because that's the common version of it. It still makes the communication between those two inefficient because I don't understand what's going on. But in a group setting, it's not just about our conversation, it's about everybody. So if everybody else is following along, and we learn this, unfortunately, we learn it associated with embarrassment and shame a lot. We're like, oh, that's a good question. It sounds stupid. If everybody else, I'm looking around, everybody else is like nodding and seems to get it. I'm the only one who doesn't understand. So I don't want to like let everybody know that I'm not getting it, which is even though it is good in that case not to interrupt, generally speaking, it's not good to be embarrassed or to associate like the reason I'm not interrupting is because it's in some way shameful or embarrassing that I'm not following along. Um, but anyway, other than those group things, yeah, interrupt. If you're doing it because you think you know where they're going, make sure that you clarify what the conclusion is that you're drawing so that it can be corrected. But if you're doing it because you are confused or you have a question or what I just said prompted you to think about something else, like, oh, you said that thing and I remembered I left my stove on or whatever. All that stuff you should always say because otherwise there's no point in me continuing to talk. And here's where this becomes really most commonly relevant in my personal like experience in my life, although I don't know how relevant this is for people's lives generally, is teaching somebody something, trying to convey information and explain something to someone. Obviously, is going to work best and be most efficient in a one-on-one situation where I can tailor, if I'm the teacher, if I'm the person trying to communicate useful information, I can tailor exactly what I'm saying to you. I can get feedback from you about what you're hearing, what you're confused about, what you're curious about, and on and on. Because we mostly start off our lives the vast majority of the time that we are learning in some way that we identify as like, I'm learning right now, as opposed to latent learning or playing, which also is learning, but we don't think of it that way. Because we mostly do that in group settings, then we do have this tendency in the future when, even if it's a one-on-one, even if I'm training you and we're talking one-on-one, you're still accessing all these rules about, you think of it as don't interrupt when the teacher is teaching you instead of don't interrupt in a group setting. And so you don't interrupt. And I say something that doesn't make sense, or I say something and you think about something else and you're not listening to what I'm saying anymore because you're distracted. In my experience, personally, a really common version of that is that I say something that doesn't make sense, and now the person is like, "Oh, should I know what that means?" And now they're focused in on whether they're doing a bad job of learning or not, and whether I think they're doing a good or a bad job of learning. But obviously, there's, for the most part, if someone's like, I might be doing a bad job learning, or I think he might be thinking that I'm too slow at learning, then they're unlikely to say, like, I didn't get that, and I'm thinking about my own learning instead of like hearing what you're saying, because I'm already embarrassed about potentially not learning as quickly as I would want or as I think you would want. And it just gets in the way. And so this cycle perpetuates because then I go a whole, however long we're spending a half an hour together going over something, and you were in your head the whole time being like, oh gosh, I didn't understand him. And I don't know if, like, am I supposed to know what he's meaning? Am I dumb? Am I a bad learner? Whatever. And then afterwards, you're thinking, well, I didn't learn anything in that entire half hour. So that reinforces this idea of like, man, I must be really slow, especially if you think that I'm a good teacher. He's a good teacher. He knows what he's talking about. He's a good therapist. He knows what he's talking about. I didn't understand it. What's wrong with me? So now it reinforces. And the next time it happens, you're even more likely to try and hide that you're not learning. And this can go for months, years, even, where I'm not learning stuff. I'm freaking out about not learning stuff. I don't want to tell you. Every time that happens, I freak out about it more, which makes me learn stuff even less and make me even more worried about telling you. If I was nervous about saying it after one sentence, I'm really nervous about saying it after a month and a year and whatever. But what is optimal is learning isn't a one-way street, right? The most efficient learning is one-on-one because both people are able to learn from each other. Sure, I have some information I'm trying to convey to you, but you have information that will help me. You have information about what you're hearing, what you understand, what connections and conclusions you're making, what language you speak so that I can phrase things or rephrase things in different ways, like what you're interpreting out of what I'm saying. So even in a scenario in which, yes, I'm the one with information that I'm trying to convey to you, and we both agree on that, there's still so much information that will make this go better for you to share with me that I can't otherwise know. If that wasn't the case, then why would we bother trying to hide that we didn't hear, right? Like we are acknowledging and trying to hide that, like, oh, I lost focus, I got distracted, whatever. In trying to hide that from the other person, that's that's an acknowledgement that like what I think and what I do and what I say is impacting them. I'm worried it will make them angry, or I'm worried they'll be frustrated with me for getting distracted or losing focus. But that's just based out of fear. And again, mostly built out of these group learning experiences in class where like, oh, somebody said the thing for 5 minutes and I didn't catch it. Then if I go and say like, hey, I didn't hear any of that afterwards because it's not good to interrupt, but then afterwards I didn't hear any of that, then it's like, well, I can't do the whole 5 minute thing again just for you. Some of the worst experiences, this is a comment, some of the worst experiences I had traveling was trying to communicate with people who jumped really quickly to conclusions about what I was saying. It can be very frustrating when people jump to conclusions quickly about what you're saying, if they are jumping to inaccurate conclusions. When you're talking with somebody who quickly jumps to conclusions about what you're saying and they're getting it right, that's what we describe as like, it's like we know each other, we finish each other's sentences, we're on the same page. And of course, even in those cases, we sometimes get it wrong. But when someone's getting it wrong, it's really frustrating. No, let me. But the worst experience, and this might be what you're talking about too. I'm not saying otherwise. Uh, is when they jumped to an inaccurate conclusion, but did not give us like somehow we got the impression that they jumped to an accurate conclusion and don't find out until much later that it was an inaccurate conclusion. That's the worst. So I'm like, yep, I got you. I'll get you there. And okay, well, I just want to say, no, I got it. And then they take us someplace and it's not where we want it to be. That's the worst. I had a dude, and it did happen more often with guys, try to sell me the wrong train ticket because he didn't want to listen to me try to explain that I had to stop through a specific station. Yeah, okay. This is a good, very common version of this. Uh, in my work, I'm often talking with people about this specifically in the context of talking to doctors. But and I agree that it is more likely to happen with men for various reasons. Men are, uh, at least in the culture that I know, but I think this is pretty widespread. Um, Men are socialized to pay less attention to what other people are saying. Men are socialized to give the answer more than to hear about the problem, jump in and save and fix things. And I'm phrasing it right now in ways that match the frustration of this experience, but I don't want to make it sound like this is all terrible stuff. It gets socialized as like you should help people, right? Like if you see someone struggling, go and help them. You see someone having a hard time, open the door, go open the door. And like we none of us would disagree with the idea that like if you see someone struggling or see someone in trouble, try to help them even if they haven't asked you yet, right? Don't force people to always have to ask you for help. Just try and help. But that's a good version, but the same thing of just try to solve people's problems. And obviously, there are times where trying to solve someone's problem without them having to ask or explain anything to you is the better thing to do. And there are other times where trying to solve someone's problem without listening to without them asking or without listening to them explain is the worst thing to do. But so it is more common with men. But also, I would say that more than the variable of being a man is the variable of being a person in a position, specifically, especially when it's your job, where you are dealing with something or some category of things constantly, day in, day out, over and over and over again, with many, many different people, each of whom is only dealing with this thing once or a few times or every so often. So I'm the guy at the train station that sells tickets. That's my whole day, every day for years. I sell tickets or whatever. And everybody coming through, they have whatever experience they have buying tickets, but like, I know this station, I know these routes. Even if you come here every day, I'm here 8 hours. Uh, this happens with doctors, medical professionals a lot. Again, worse with men, but the more relevant variable is the situation where it's like patient comes in and says, I got X, Y, and Z. Okay, I see this all the time. I see it every day. I know exactly what to do, including that sometimes the person then is saying, like, no, but it's not that, it's this other thing. And I've seen that a million times. And it always turns out to, be the thing that I said it was. And their objection is based on this other thing instead. And it becomes a pattern then. And it is therefore more efficient in theory to just anticipate, like, oh, I've seen this a million times. This is where we're going to end up. Let me jump in. Now, obviously, sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes the person, like you're saying, no, I have to go to a specific station on the way, modifies what is the best route to get to your final destination. And so I'm used to a million times people saying, like, I need to go here. Where do I go? And I give them the answer. And that answer doesn't work here. Or if I'm a doctor, a million times I've heard somebody say, like, I'm a little headachy and feverish and whatever, and it's always dehydration or whatever, and they always are like, no, it feels like more than that, but then it turns out that it's dehydration. Well, but sometimes it is actually more than that, and sometimes the person knows that and has information about that, like in this case, you know what train station you need to stop at, and it can be very, very frustrating then to be that person trying to, like, I understand that you've had a million other people say this thing, but my version's a little different, because part of what they're used to is people saying my version's a little different. It can be so frustrating to get people's attention on it. I'm mentioning doctors a lot, in part because I do work with clients sometimes to help them to be able to communicate to doctors specifically in a way to kind of cut through that and get to a point where the doctor will hear what it is that you're trying to say. I go to the front counter knowing my language skills aren't great, and it's much more reassuring when they ask questions and clarify and double check their understanding. Yeah, again, drawing conclusions is inevitable, and it's helpful to jump in as soon as you have drawn a conclusion if you clarify, like, this is what I think you're asking, this is what I think you're getting at. Is that the case? Another one of the variables that's going to make this happen more often, that's relevant to the train station, but also relevant to doctors, is when there's a time pressure. When, like, I have other people that are also waiting for my help, and so, like, the longer I spend with you, the more disrupts my ability to go help those people, that's also going to lead to me wanting, whether I consciously identify that I'm doing it more or not, I'm going to jump to conclusions more quickly and try and cut things off more quickly. And I'm less likely to clarify this is what because I'm trying to save on time. Like I get it, instead of like, I think what you're saying is blah, 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 blah. And yeah, very frustrating. Dealing with customer service is often like this too. Like calling in, that's part of the reason that calling call centers is so frustrating is like they've heard from a bunch of people that, every tech place when you're calling for support has to be like, did you turn it off and on again? Is it plugged in? Because they get a crap ton of calls from people where like, no, it wasn't plugged in. So it makes sense for them to start there. They have no way of knowing that I am a person who already checked that it's plugged in. I've already turned it off and on again. I've already tried X, Y, and Z. So there's not really anything to be done about it in that context in which like they can't anticipate who I am as an individual, even though the actual conversation is one-on-one. The conversation is designed to be applicable to any random person who calls in. And so I'll have to go through like, yep, it's plugged in. Yes, I turned it off and on again, till we can get to the part where I actually haven't figured it out or gotten, need more information. But anyway, this is why I spend so much time teaching people to interrupt me. My staff, my clients, people when I am giving a presentation, but people in my personal life too. Because even if I'm getting frustrated, even in the case in which I would get frustrated by it, which doesn't happen often, but I'm a human and I get frustrated by things from time to time too. Um, Even in that case, I would still rather know what it is you're thinking so that I don't like, I wouldn't say something if I didn't think that it might be useful to you or to me or both of us, for you to hear it. So if you're distracted by something else, and I've used distraction a lot today, and I mean that in the sense that people think of themselves as being distracted, because I personally don't find that to be a useful framework. But if you think of it as you're distracted, that makes you more likely to be embarrassed and not want to, or, losing focus, which is also not a concept I think is useful. If you think of it that way, you're more likely to be like, oh, I should hide the fact that my attention just wandered. I lost focus, got distracted. Uh, there's a comment, but I realized I didn't finish that statement. They're like, uh, even in those cases, I'd still rather know. I'd rather the interruption happen so that I can clarify what it is that I'm saying. Uh, oh yeah, I've also had a station attendant see me looking anxious and confused in the middle of the station, walked over and asked what I needed. And once he saw I had the wrong ticket and needed to get on a high-speed train that was leaving in a few minutes, he grabbed my bag and brought it through the gate, told me to go through the counter where they waved me through, and he met me on the other side and told me to just buy the right ticket when I got to the place I was going. Good, I like that. Like an example of the opposite, where like someone jumping to conclusions was very, very helpful to you, and had he slowed down and clarified everything, you would have missed your train. Oh, that was long. Twitch it might have filtered it out. Uh, oh, and then you started writing that same message again. Because it seems like you thought that maybe it hadn't gone through. Oh, yeah, I've also had a station attendant see me looking anxious, confused, etc. Um, yeah, sorry, that was the one where I was finishing my statement before reading it. Um, yeah, again, it's not that interrupting is bad. It's not that interrupting is good. It's like everything that while it is very useful, while it is often very useful to categorize things in large ways, to identify patterns, to identify what we're talking when we say interrupting, what we're saying is starting to speak while the person with whom you are in conversation is still speaking. They've started speaking, they're still speaking, and you start to speak as they're still speaking. That's interruption. The idea that's going to be the same in all contexts is absurd. But it's not very helpful to us to be like, well, everything is a thing unto itself. Like it's really it's impossible to learn to navigate things or become better at things or improve processes, navigate successfully, whatever. It's impossible to do that without being able to identify some commonalities, like, oh, this is reminiscent of this other thing, so maybe if I do what worked well then, it will work well now. So of course we find patterns. And what we're just trying to do is apply those patterns as broadly as is useful. And then we go too broadly and it becomes no longer useful. So we want to identify when we've gone too far and scale it back, not eliminate it, right? Interrupting is bad is an overbroad conclusion. It it's useful in a lot of scenarios. There's a reason that we are taught it commonly because even though the context is pretty niche in which that is broadly true, it's a context in which we find ourselves a lot of our lives growing up. Uh, sorry, I used to twitch on mobile being unpredictable. Uh, and so we apply it over broadly. But then the next problem is that people, when they identify like, actually, sometimes interrupting is good, is that they apply that over broadly and they reject the first conclusion. I was taught that it's bad to interrupt, but that's nonsense. It's not bad to interrupt. It's good to interrupt. That's an overbroad conclusion too. We want to try and the metaphor I'm using all the time, right? If I give you a hammer, I say this is a great tool, and I show you how to use it, and then you use it by mimicking me. You hit some nail into some wood, it works and it's great. And then you're using it and you're keeping it, and you're like, this is a great tool. It helps me so much. Things are way better than before I had this tool. I used to try and hammer nails in with my hand, and it was terrible. It hurt and it didn't work. And then I try and use the hammer to cut a piece of wood in half, and that's terrible, and it doesn't work, and it hurts me, and it causes problems. Generally, people's first response to something like that is to reject that as a fluke. Like, oh, weird. This tool works for me all the time. It didn't work that time, but I guess it just doesn't work sometimes. And so I keep treating it as though it's something that I can use for anything. And I use it to try and cut wood again. It doesn't work again. At a certain point, it's no longer about rejecting this experience and being like, no, this evidence that the tool is flawed, I'm ignoring it, I'm writing it off. Once it happens enough times, and it could be once, but some number of times, then I'm like, oh, okay, so never mind, this tool sucks. And then we have a tendency to apply that over broadly. In the same way we said a good tool is good for everything, now we're like, well, a tool that isn't good for everything isn't good for anything. And we throw the hammer away, and we go around talking to other people being like, hammers are terrible tools. And they're like, what are you talking about? I use it all the time and it's great for me. Like, no, it's awful. What we want to do is scale it back, not come to the opposite overbroad conclusion. You thought it was a good tool. No, it's a bad tool. We scale it back to it is a good tool in this context specifically. Outside of that context, it is not a useful tool. In this context, it's actually a tool that makes things worse. And I know that metaphor makes it seem like oversimple, but this stuff happens all the time with concepts, right? A random example, but the first thing that pops in my head is the way that people will often talk about capitalism. The vast majority of time that someone is talking about capitalism, they're not referring to the specific economic system of capitalism. That label is being applied, and that's fine. This isn't about correcting what does capitalism really mean. Just pointing out that the vast majority of the time that term is being used, it's as a label for like the way that currently culture is constructed, especially as it relates to money and corporations and like incentive structures. Hammers are awful. What you really need is a good heavy wrench. Yeah, people are incentivized to do that too, unfortunately, especially influential people. Because if I'm good at identifying people who have tried to use a hammer to cut a piece of wood in half, and then good at stepping in and being like, look, I know people gave you that hammer. I know they told you it was great, but obviously it's not. They're going to try and explain how it's still a great tool, even though your experience of it right now is that it is terrible. But I'm telling you, it is terrible. You're right. Of course it's terrible. What's better is a wrench. And then I try and sell you that wrench as though that's the new tool. And if I'm good at that stuff, then lots and lots of people buy my wrench, which then makes it easier for me to continue to sell more wrenches. And yes, that's how we end up with, I'm not going to like throw any particular specific thought or theory or whatever under the bus, but popular psychology concepts that get huge, right? Is somebody put it out there as like, this is the way you've been thinking is wrong. This is the correct way to think about it. It spreads enough that then that its popularity becomes part of the evidence that people use to say, like, this is the correct way to think about it. See, look at how everybody thinks about it. Nuance is difficult to sell, especially on a broad level. To be like, well, yeah, sometimes the way that you were taught to do things works and sometimes it doesn't. And it's tricky to understand when it's which, and you're never going to do it perfectly. But, you know, anyway, I got to wrap up here in a minute. What was I saying? I was saying something about, yes, we don't, it's not that things are good or bad, it's that they're good or bad for a specific thing or in a particular context or whatever. We have to attach that to the particular outcome or the particular metric that we're using. Nothing is good or bad writ broadly, good in all contexts, universally good or universally bad. But we have a tendency to go that way. So, no, I'm not saying interrupting is always good. I'm saying that in some contexts it's actually bad because it makes the communication more inefficient. In some cases, it makes the communication more efficient. In some contexts in which it would or could theoretically make the communication more efficient, it's being said to a person who responds to it in a way that makes things worse. So even though it's one on one, and even though, I'm trying to clarify whatever, if me interrupting you to say that makes you angry with me and you decide you don't want to talk to me anymore, then that's worse. That's part of why we all learn that, like, even in these individual contexts, I should be careful about interrupting because sometimes it makes it worse. We're just trying to read it. And I guess sometimes for me, I worry, or it seems like, I guess worry is probably, for me, I worry that spending an hour or 50 minutes or whatever talking about something like this in that level of nuance, when it comes down to it, what's the, like, boiled down takeaway is, like, sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's harmful, and that's not very useful to anybody. That's my concern, is that, the reason that nuanced understandings are not more widespread is because they're very difficult to then, like, take away in some, in order to remember and apply things, we need to make them small enough to be able to remember. We can't remember the whole book, we just remember synopsis, right? And so I do worry that that's part of the issue here, is that being nuanced and accurate, I hope, even if the takeaway is just sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not, I hope that that is helpful in and of itself, because at least it alleviates some of the shame and embarrassment and guilt around, like, sometimes I interrupt people and sometimes I'm too afraid to interrupt people. Sometimes I try to help people without them asking for the help and they don't like it, or I jump to the wrong conclusion. And sometimes I don't ask, yeah, don't help people and they're asking me to, or, like, that we make mistakes on both sides. So at least understanding that there are both sides and everybody makes mistakes on both sides, I hope that helps. But in terms of, like, is this a framework that helps somebody to navigate? Is this a good situation in which to interrupt or not? I genuinely believe that it is helpful for me to talk like this to anybody who is paying attention, to whatever extent they're paying attention, even if, as is likely the case, they don't consciously remember, they don't remember what I'm saying or remind themselves, oh, we just happen to be pretty used to, like, the way that I improve things is by learning something and then consciously applying it, remembering it consciously and saying it to myself or forcing myself to do it. And so we think of that as, like, the only thing that's useful, where my hope, my belief, and my hope is that talking like this, even if it doesn't get remembered, even if I can't later on then say, like, well, this is a situation which is good to interrupt, that even if none of that happens, that it still does shape those other processes, the ones that dictate what we notice and what we don't, and what our impulse is, that it still impacts those, so that even if we don't remember it, it does modify, like, what we're watching for to determine whether or not this is a good time for me to jump in and interrupt, or whether I should hold back. It's my hope. Of course, I would never really be able to know if that's true, because theoretically here, the whole point of that is that the person themselves wouldn't be able to identify that that is the case. So I would never know, but I hope. And even if it is the case, my worry is that people will still hear these things and be like, so your point is sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, and there's no way to really know, and get annoyed or frustrated or think of it as useless, which, as long as it's still helpful, I don't mind so much. But if people think it's useless, they're less likely to, you know, pay attention or participate or come back. And then if I do have the ability to be helpful, not anymore if they're not around. So I guess that's an encapsulation of part of the same stuff that it's about thinking of when you're considering interrupting or have an impulse or not to interrupt is just trying my best to kind of get as much nuance and useful information across as possible while also packaging it in a way that I think is likely to keep people paying attention. And you know, to be able to help someone, by communicating with them, there's lots of ways to help, but specifically to help someone by sharing information with them or communicating with them, you have to be able to communicate helpful things, which means you have to have the helpful things to communicate, but also that you have to be able to communicate it to them. You have to have the content and the ability to get it across. And part of the ability to get it across is the ability to get a person's attention. If you're looking for directions and I know the directions, but I only speak English and you only speak Italian, then I probably can't help you. If we both speak English, but I don't know the directions you're looking for, I can't help you. But even if we both speak English and I have the directions that we're looking for, if I don't have your attention, I can't help you. That's part of it. So, I guess maybe just don't judge yourself for being a coward if you don't like fight something with somebody, like maintaining a relationship and, providing for, allowing, not precluding future opportunities to try and convey something later, trying to get something across in a very small and subtle and non-controversial way so that you don't risk like losing access to trying to do it again later. That's not cowardice. There's reasons to do it. And of course, then there are other times where it's like you're doing it in that way and you won't have an opportunity later anyway, and it might be useful. Who knows? Anyway, I gotta go. Feedback allows us to know if it's useful in the moment. Active observation and listening can let us know if it was productive in the moment. Interesting to think about. Um, yes, interesting to think about, but I gotta go. Good to be with you. Thank you, Fast Insider. Thank you, Dad, for participating in the chat. I will be back next week. Hopefully, someone with me. Same time. Be well. Talk to you all later.